Welcome to Banyan Books, Branches of Wisdom, celebrating the joy of bright ideas and heartful lifelong learning. Branches of Wisdom is a series of intimate conversations with the world's most influential authors and visionaries. We explore spirituality and the human mind, ecology and culture. Most episodes are recorded with a live audience. You can join our live events and submit questions to your favorite guests. Check out our upcoming schedule at banyan.com. Since 1970, Banyan Books has been a rich oasis at the crossroads of wisdom and philosophy, offering resources for humanity's evolving paths. We're a locally owned, independent bookstore in the heart of Vancouver's Kitsilano neighborhood. Visit us in person or shop online at banyan.com. Please subscribe, follow, like, and leave your reviews for the podcast. And now, enjoy. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Branches of Wisdom, the Banyan Books podcast. I'm your host, Ross McKeechee, and delighted today that we're joined by our very special guest, Dr. Neil Douglas-Klotz. Before we get to his formal introduction, Banyan Books acknowledges that although we have people joining us from all over the world for these live streaming events, the physical location of Banyan Books and Sound is on the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Our guest today, Neil Douglas-Klotz, PhD, is an internationally known scholar in the fields connecting religious studies, comparative Semitic hermeneutics, and psychology. He is a teacher, an author, a poet, and musician. His specialty is in the native traditions of Southwest Asia, also known as the Middle East. In 1982, together with the Reverend Tasneem Fernandez, our guest co-founded the International Network for the Dances of Universal Peace. He is the past chair of the Mysticism Group of the American Academy of Religion and is active in various international colloquia and conferences dedicated to peace and spirituality. He co-founded the Edinburgh International Centre for Spirituality and Peace in 2007, together with Neil Walker. And as a registered Scottish charity, the group actively sponsors talks, dialogues, and cultural and spiritual forums that explore the connections between spirituality, ecology, economics, and politics. Dr. Douglas-Klotz is the author of, or co-author of 15 books and 3 audio sets. His books include Prayers of the Cosmos, The Hidden Gospel, The Sufi Book of Life, and The Tent of Abraham, which was written with Sister Joan Chittister and Rabbi Arthur Waskow. Today, Dr. Neil Douglas-Klotz is with Banyan Books in conversation about his newest book, Revelations of the Aramaic Jesus, Hidden Teachings on Life and Death. In this book, he brings forth 40 years of research to update his pioneering work on the Lord's Prayer and the Beatitudes, and take readers further into Jesus' healings and inner transmission. Through expansions of Aramaic's multiple meanings as well as guided contemplations, Douglas-Klotz's new book provides a guide to transformation through the way of the prophet of Nazareth. It shows how Jesus' deepest teachings address contemporary challenges such as our relationships with nature and each other, as well as the purpose of life itself. If you would like to learn more about today's honored guest, you can visit his website, which is www.abwoon.org. That's abwoon.org. Ladies and gentlemen, Banyan community, please join me in a warm welcome for Dr. Neil Douglas-Klotz. Hello and welcome.
Thank you, Ross. Greetings from Scotland.
It's so great to have you with us. Thanks for being here.
Coast to coast.
Coast to coast. Okay, so jumping right in this really is a wonderful book. And for someone like me who hasn't studied much of Jesus's teachings, and I would imagine even for people that have, it really is well named. It's a revelation. In the book's introduction, you write the following: my doctorate in religious studies ended up combining ancient Semitic language hermeneutics or interpretation theory and somatic or body-oriented psychology in order to be able to begin to articulate an epistemology, a way of knowing that approached that of Yeshua. I'm wondering if you can expand a little bit for our audience on your background and the approach that you use in trying to understand Jesus's teachings.
Yeah, you've picked all the fanciest words from my book, Ross. And hopefully they don't put people off, but I have to put those in from the scholarly side. What I'm talking about here is that no one argues against the fact that Jesus spoke Aramaic, an ancient Semitic language which grew out of an even more ancient nomadic experience of the peoples of Southwest Asia, which we normally call the Middle East. But that way of looking at life that produced these languages, including Egyptian, ancient Hebrew, Aramaic, and even up until Quranic Arabic, the Arabic through which the Quran originally comes to Prophet Muhammad. This way of looking at life is much, much different than our own. It's extremely different. And although we sometimes look back at so-called primitive peoples, and this still happens even today, and we think, oh, well, they were telling all these myths and stories, just to wait until Western science could come along and explain, everything to them in the terms of, molecules and atoms and all this other stuff. But this was actually a different and equally valid way of looking at life, such that, and I'll just give you a simple example of it, a tree was not simply a tree, or you could say an object outside of us that could become a table, or it could give us fruit, or any of these things. But a tree was a living being that had its own aura, it had its own personality. You could say there would be a tree being would be apparent to a person from, say, 10,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, in most of the ancient world. This is why we have for instance, the Australian Aboriginal tradition, they speak about dream time. So that's because dream time meant that the way of looking at life included what we now call our dream life. As one author put it, it's as though we were wearing our subconscious on the outside. If that's a bit too much for people to take in, today, people are trying to come back to this very strongly by feeling themselves much more embedded in nature. Well, the ancient peoples were already feeling themselves embedded in nature. And this is what I aim to show in my various books, not just the Aramaic of Jesus, although we're going to talk about that today, but my other books as well, is that this way of looking at life, where inside and outside are not that separate. In fact, they're not really separate at all. This is something that we can reclaim a bit of, even while we're sitting here in, early 21st century northern hemisphere, and we're feeling much more separate from nature, from each other than we have, for thousands of years. So it seems to be about Jesus, and it is about Jesus, only because he's been misheard for so many years. One of my friends once said that Jesus is the most projected upon person in modern history, in that he's been used as a screen to broadcast all sorts of different ideas, which unfortunately, in many cases, became interwoven with politics or with empire, we could say. And so misinterpretations of both Jesus as well as the Hebrew Scriptures, the so-called Old Testament, led to a lot of, you could say, of the tragic effects of, of Western development, including colonialism, racism, ecocide, and a whole bunch of other things I'll just throw out at the beginning. So, here I've tossed the whole thing into your lap, Ross, and we can go and talk about Jesus if you want. But, my interest was really sparked and it continues to be sparked by this whole notion that our consciousness today could be different than what it is. And until human consciousness changes, we're not going to see changes outside of us that many of us do want to see change. It's not just a matter of mysticism or spirituality. It's really about changing our way of looking at life around us.
Yeah, that gives such good context for why this kind of work that you're doing is important, why it matters. And I think that's really good for us to understand. It gives a bigger context. One of the things that seems important, excuse me, as well, is understanding the kind of creation story or the way of looking at reality that Jesus would have and his people would have been coming from at that time. In the prologue to the book, you describe that sort of creation story, or those two kind of poles of reality, as you call them, of the ancient Semitic languages and culture, and those two forces that, as you say, arose from a prior mystery. I'm wondering if you can describe that for us now.
Well, again, this was the way of looking at everything, all and everything, that the ancient Semitic languages had. To simplify it somewhat, and I can't put it as poetically as I do in the book, because I worked long and hard on that prologue, I'll tell you, Ross. There's a sense in which we are connected everywhere all the time with everything. And this is a word in Aramaic that can be translated as breath or soul. Sometimes it's not translated as self, but this is the breath that's on 24/7, connected from before our birth to after our death, our physical death. It continues while we're in dream life, all of this. And this Aramaic calls ruha. And then there's an individualized sense of our self or breath. This is the I, the individualness of life, which sees things as independent or semi-independent, if you go back far enough. So there's a localized breath that is in my body just for these number of years that I have flesh. And again, I'm using Semitic language terms. So there's an all and everything and connected through light, through sound, and then there's an individual here and now, both of which are very important to, again, the ancient Semitic way of looking at life and why creation happened. And it's not as though they're separate by some wall or something like this. No, it's more like they're what is normally understood, to be a polarity. So there's a connection between the two. Sort of like the way, it's prosaic to say, but it's like yin and yang. A little bit of one is embedded in the other. And in this polarity, it's like the two poles, north and south pole of the planet, is a magnetic field from our individual self to our always-on connected self. And, sometimes we head towards one pole and sometimes we head toward the other pole. And Yeshua is recommending, and the ancient Semitic mystics also did, the prophets, if you want to call them prophets, they were prophets, that we sort of learn to stand in the middle. We learn to be in the middle and to feel both. And the place where we would feel both is, wait for it, the heart, in the heart. The heart is what unites both of these polarities in us.
On the note of the heart, we were hoping that you might maybe share a practice, and I think you might share some chanting in Aramaic with us that might connect us with our heart before we go further along. Would that be all right?
Sure, we can do that. I've been talking a lot and and maybe fast, but anyway, you can always replay it. It's worth noting, and we'll do a heart-based meditation. And people ask me, oh, well, Neil, aren't you making all this stuff up from later, from whatever? Well, no, because ancient Semitic languages only have a word for the heart. They don't have a word for the mind at all. There is no word for the mind in ancient Hebrew, ancient Aramaic, or you could say the Arabic of the Quran. Where our thoughts, so to speak, occur are on the surface of the heart. And this is a way of looking at life. You can take it as reality or not reality, but it was the way that the ancient Semitic peoples looked at it because they were originally nomads. They were following their heart following the rhythm of their heart, in tune with nature, with the seasons, and with their breath. So that brings us to the little chant I'll share with you now.
Wonderful.
We're going to chant a couple of words from Yeshua. Allah, which is the word that he uses for reality or the great mystery. Usually it's translated as God, although I don't prefer that translation. Really, Allah means that which embraces both polarities of life, that which brings it all together, unity in a conceptual term. But it's more than a conceptual term. It's like bringing yes and no together in the heart and then feeling what that does. You know, how do we say, the no of life and the yes of life. Can we bring them together in the heart and feel the unity in that? And can the heart hold that? So Allah is the word that Yeshua uses for the divine. He uses it quite often. It's quite similar to the later Arabic Allah. There's only one sound different. And it's similar to the Hebrew also, Elohim. Elohim in ancient Hebrew becomes Eloha, but that's enough of the language stuff. And so we're going to chant Allah Ruha. That's the word I just mentioned. Ruha, Allah is this breath that is connecting me to all beings, to nature, to us here as we're sitting here, or you're watching on YouTube, or wherever you're watching on the recording. Time and space doesn't matter, even if you're watching tomorrow. From my point of view, it's all the same time, you could say, from the Ruha time, from the atmosphere of the big breath. So this breath is at all times, all places. So we'll just chant a little bit of this, Allah Ruha, and then we'll breathe some of these words. This has generally been the practice that I divined, if you will, excuse the expression, from the ancient Middle Eastern traditions. We chant words, we feel our bodies moving a bit from the heart, and then we feel the words inside, and then gradually we let the words just dissolve into the feeling of our own breathing, because words are just a doorway for us to have a wordless experience. So here we go. Let's see how this is going to go. And just, feel yourself moving. If you can feel the center of your body awareness drop a bit from the head, which is where mostly it is when we're watching stuff on the internet, feel that dropping into the heart a bit more and just sort of move a bit with the eyes maybe half closed, soft eyes, and then, go from there. Allah Ruha, 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 Allah Allah Ruha. 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 So we're taking a full, natural, easy breath. Natural breath in, natural breath out, feeling our hearts. And if we want to maybe feel it a bit more, placing one hand lightly over the heart, not reaching or grasping, just as though listening with the hand, feeling our chest rise and fall, breath going down underneath us, touching the core of the earth, coming from around us, from way above us. We're part of that larger breath. Unity is breathing us. We are being breathed with this larger breath, which Yeshua calls sacred breath, sometimes translated as Holy Spirit. Allah Ruha, breathing in. Allah Ruha, breathing out. Ruha. And then we just allow the words themselves to dissolve into our feeling of our breath. And we continue to breathe, perhaps with this expanded and deeper sense of our connection to one another. Amen, amen, amen.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
What changes when we start to understand Yeshua or Jesus' words and teachings through the lens of his native language, and not just that, but the time and place that he was in?
Yeah, great question. I'm glad you asked it that way. Well, for those of us raised Christian, and I'm among those, it changes quite a bit of it clears up some confusion, shall we say. Often what we had in for instance, the King James Version of the Bible is very limited translations. Some of them are absolutely outright wrong, but a greater number of them are actually very limited. For instance, the phrase that we were chanting there in the practice, Allah Ruha, is a phrase from the Gospel of John. And Jesus says this to a woman, a Samaritan woman actually, a person he wasn't supposed to be talking to. And that's translated in the King James Version as God is a spirit, which is very confusing. Well, God is supposed to be God. How can God be a spirit? And then what about the Holy Spirit? So if we understand that in Aramaic, the word ruha means breath or spirit or wind or air, all of those, then we begin to look at Yeshua's sayings from a very, very different viewpoint, where my breath is not separate from holy breath or from sacred breath, or ruha de is the way he would have put it. And Yeshua, this is one of the things that he's trying to remind folks of, that your breath is not separate from, it's not separate from the breath of those that are around you, or the breath to which all that returns, and as he calls it, ruha de. Also, as I dropped in before briefly, there wasn't this separation between outer life and inner life. There's no preposition in Aramaic. Preposition is like of or in or within. There's only one preposition that means both within and among. So within me and among us here now, as I'm speaking to you through the internet. So the within and the among, that's the same word. So, for instance, Yeshua is quoted as saying the kingdom of, so-called kingdom, and I'll get to that in a bit, the kingdom of God is within you, or the kingdom of God is among you. Well, in both cases, he said the same thing, because Aramaic only has a word for within and among. And while we're on the subject of kingdom, that is a mistranslation, because in both Greek and Aramaic, the word is feminine gendered. So if you want to go feudalistic with your translation, it should be queendom. It's an interesting day to be speaking of kings and queens, but we won't go into that subject right now. For those of you listening, it was the coronation of Charles today as the king, and it's quite a ritual actually, but I won't go into some of these elements of ritual. But really speaking, Malkuta, which is the word that was translated from Aramaic as kingdom, really means that which says I can, that which arises within us. It's a form of vision together with empowerment that is nature, that is native, that is natural to the human being. As children, we develop, it was said, this sense of malk or malkuta, which happens around 2 or 3 when, for instance, I say to my mother, hey, I can do this myself. Let me do this myself. I want to do this myself. This sort of I can is what arises in the human being as just part of our growing up. It's just part of growing up. It's nothing wrong about it. There's no original sin involved. And then we hopefully spend our whole life learning what I really means. Who is the I? Who is the self? Who is this person speaking? It's meant to not be stuck in one place, like in the 2-year-old state, or in the 5-year-old state, or even in the 20-year-old state, depending on how old you are listening. This I-ness is meant to evolve. Our individual self is meant to evolve and learn. What are we supposed to learn? Well, we're supposed to learn how to connect our individual self, our individual breath, with this ruha, which is where I started. So that individual breath is called nafsha in Aramaic, and it's usually what's translated as self, or often translated as self in the Gospels. That creates a lot of, or sometimes it's even translated as life in the Gospels, like the one who loses their life will find it, and the one who finds their life will lose it. And that's really about, how this individual self that we have, you could call it ego, although it's really, I'd rather not use that word because it has a lot of Freudian baggage to it. The individual self, this I, is a real thing. It's a gift. It's not an illusion, according to the ancient Semitic peoples. It's a gift that you're meant to develop. And so even though it will disappear at some stages, maybe for some people it disappeared during this breath meditation that we did when we dissolved into the big breath, but then we reclaim it and hopefully it comes back in a different sense. So these are, and one other thing, since you asked about the view of people around him, there's no strict separation between past, present, and future in ancient Aramaic. So what you could say, they're all connected. It's not like the past is over and done with and the future is not yet to come. No, again, based on this nomadic understanding of people, where they're traveling in a caravan, our ancestors leave before us. So you could say the past is ahead of us traveling, and then our children and their children's children are behind us. So we can't see them, they're in the unseen, or maybe they're in the seen already, but let's say generations who are coming after us, they're alive and moving also. So just as we have in some Native American traditions where they're talking about thinking for 7 generations, the same thing was in the ancient Semitic languages, that there was a consideration of that we're connected, yes, to the best of our ancestors. I bracket the best of our ancestors, not the worst. And then we want to be concerned about what we leave for those who are coming along in the caravan after us. And this was the basic attitude of life. It was changing at the time of Yeshua, that is Jesus, but this was the basic attitude of the ancient nomadic Semitic people for tens of thousands of years, and it comes into the language very much. And I'll stop there. Back to you, Ross.
No, I could listen to you talk about this all day, but one of the things I pulled from the book was one of the messages I felt you were really trying to convey was that Jesus was bringing forth this teaching of an integrated human being, where this, I hope I get the word right, nafsha, the individual or small self, integrated with the divine big self, the ruha. Do I have that right? Is that a core message of his teaching from this view?
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you got that. Because some people skip this whole prologue and the whole thing because they just want to learn about words and what the words mean. But it's, yes, this would be my view. And it's not only my view, it's a few of others, that Yeshua comes at a particular time, in a particular, and I'm not saying he was unique or that he was the only one that came that offered this, but he came to show at this particular, you could say, turning point in history of that area anyway, how the individual self and the always on connected breath, big breath self, how they could be integrated in a person here and now. You know, as this individual self is evolving, and this is part of the view of that's coming along. 100,000 years ago, we were much more embedded in nature and everything and the dream life and all of that, as I was mentioning. Okay, now at about 2,000 years ago, the individual self is starting to separate it. It's already actually quite separate from other individuals. We're no longer as embedded in community. Well, that's 2,000 years ago. I mean, what is it now? I mean, now it's all individualized. It's all atomized in a sense. As I say, sometimes we could, in its negative fashion, we could look at it as a selfish culture that we're living in. But for Yeshua, the human self, the individual self, was a gift that we're meant to use properly. So, and what's the gift? Well, the gift is the heart, the will to change, the will to integrate, the will to, okay, even though I'm feeling separate now, I can feel connected with all of you here, live or recording. And that's a real thing. And I can feel connected around me in nature when I go for walks up in the hills up here in Scotland. And I can feel connected on a deeper level. You don't need Jesus for that, but Jesus showed that these trends today and the positive trends of the human self to, you could say, you know, care for nature in a better way, to try to unwind some of the, you could say, the abuses of the past several thousand years, that these are real choices that we're here to make right now. And so life does matter. Life in our human body, in our enfleshed body, does matter. And he showed, you know, how one person can change things. Now, what comes later, what comes after him, I'll bracket that. I'll also leave that aside. What religion made of him, that's a different story. But what he comes is this very profound vision of what humanity can become. Not just wiping away, you know, the individual self, but not becoming so selfie, so self-occupied, so self-oriented that we create a world that is not the world we'd want to live in.
On this topic of self-inflation, in chapter 4, which is titled Warnings About Willful Unripeness, you contrast the Beatitudes in Matthew with those in Luke. And as you say in these Beatitudes, in Luke, they warn in uncompromising language about the dangers of self-inflation and self-satisfaction. And that for these very contemporary illnesses, Yeshua proposes a different course of healing medicine. Can you explain a little bit about the differences between the Beatitudes in Matthew and Luke, and then also talk a bit about this kind of course of healing medicine that he prescribes?
Sure. In Matthew, he's providing a much more comforting, soothing medicine. This is for his close followers, according to the Aramaic Christian tradition. And most of them were homeless. Most of them had, we'd say most of the people actually at that time were very, very poor. It was almost all underclass. There was almost no middle class. And then, you know, there was a super rich, you know, small percentile, if any of that sounds familiar, even more small percentile, if you can imagine, than it was here. And they were generally collaborating with the Romans. So Yeshua is talking to this, not the people who are in the temple political axis, we could say. He's saying to them, for instance, in Matthew, and I'll just give you one example. He says, you're in a ripe, at the right moment, at the right place, blessedly right place and time, when you realize that your breath is your only home, when you realize that your breathing is the only thing you have. You're connected to this rucha, breath. That's your real home. And when you realize that, whether you're physically homeless or not, then things open up to you. So he's talking to people there that are, using AA terms, they're sort of hit rock bottom. They don't have anything. They don't have anywhere to go. They're going to hang with him, until they can't. In Luke, he seems to be speaking to people. People have come along, and we can see this in the Gospels, that there were spies coming, you could say, from the temple, trying to catch him in things that, he might say that would be sacrilegious, that they could condemn him for. And also he was, you could say, on a lesser level, he was warning some of his close, very close disciples who were already thinking in terms of status. And this is a real danger. And even spiritual groups at that time, we see this also in the Gospels. Well, who's going to be greater when you go, Master, and who's going to be the one, and yada, yada, and all that. So he's also warning them. So he says in an equivalent place in the Beatitudes in Luke, he says, ripe are you now if you have less self, less nafsha. So he's not talking about, finding your home in the breath. He's talking about just have less self right now. Calm down your inner grasping self, which is thinking, oh, I'm so wonderful because I'm in Yeshua's close circle, and I'm going to be one of the ones, or he's going to go to heaven and take me with him, or I don't know. There are different, or there were different views of Yeshua would lead some armed revolution, perhaps at the time, and so then we'll be at his right hand and left hand, and all that stuff. So these are natural human reactions, but he warns in Luke. He's using, you could say, this very sort of shock language, not blessed are those who, it's like people hear. You can hear it if you want to hear it, but it's okay for you right now. Watch out for this. Woe if you have this inflated sense of self. You're going to have problems if you always seek to be full all the time, or if you're always trying to be laughing all the time, and you don't have a balance in life, if you're not finding this balanced place in the heart. And particularly this one he has, I can't remember which number it was, which verse it was in Luke, but this thing of trying to be full all the time is a very modern ailment. Not just full of food, but also full of experiences. We get more experiences, new, more, new. Well, what about finding the new, deep within ourselves before we're constantly trying to buy more, experience more, stream more, or whatever? So these messages can be heard, I think, in a very contemporary way, which is also what I tried to do a bit in the new book.
I just want to take a moment to remind our live audience that we'll be getting to some of your questions around the last 15 minutes of this live streaming event. So go ahead. I see there's already some coming in. Go ahead and type them into the chat there on YouTube, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. One of the things that really interested me, Neil, was in chapter 14, which is titled Straightening Out the Self with Love. You talk about one of Jesus's best known sayings, which I'll quote it, is, a new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another, as I have loved you, that you also love one another. I'm wondering, because the way that you give the Aramaic version and kind of describe the process of what that actually looks like in practice was fascinating to me. So can you give first maybe a bit of the story of when and why he was saying this, and then the Aramaic version and how he breaks it down and what it means?
Yeah, he's he says something like this twice during his last conversation with his students, his disciples as they're called, in the Gospel of John. This is at the so-called, or just before the so-called Last Supper. Once is right after he washes his disciples' feet, his students' feet. And if you're raised Christian, you remember all this stuff. But I mean, Peter objects, says, no, I should wash your feet. And Yeshua says to him, no, well, this exemplifies how you should do things. You should think of yourself, not as the first or as the most important, but, as a person who is the servant, basically willing to serve. Use your individual sense of self in that sense. And then he uses the phrase, det habun had lechad, ikanade and ahebtakun. Det habun or ahebtakun, these are both the same word in Aramaic for love. There are various words, but this is one of the most powerful love words that we have in the Semitic languages. It's in ancient Hebrew in a certain form, and it also comes into the Sufi vocabulary, also through Quran. And it's based on the root acheb. And acheb is a type of love that grows slowly. The image I use in a number of my books is that it's though you have a small fire kindled, and then gradually you add more kindling to it, and then slowly, with your breath, with your heart, with your attention, you build this fire into a big, warming, blaze on which you can cook and warm yourself. And, on an individual, you could say a psychological level, it's more like, okay, well, first we have tolerance for another person, just bare tolerance, and then we might develop respect, and then we might develop, more than respect, which would be a sort of friendship, and then that gradually deepens into a deep friendship, and then even more deeply into a very deep love. And this is the type of love that he recommends. Based on what we were talking about before, it's the type of love that is not like on and off. It's the type of love in which the self, the human self, the I, develops along with this love. It's not just I'm developing love as this thing, this emotion, but I also am developing as this love is warming and growing, and as my circle of love, you could say, of deeper love, not easy love, but deeper love, continues to grow. And this is what he uses also, I think it's in Luke. It's the same love word where it's usually translated, love your enemies. And what he says there is use this slowly growing sense of, you could say, tolerance, respect, to sort of bring yourself into rhythm with that person very slowly. Find a rhythm that will be matching with theirs, even if they don't know it. It isn't like going up to them saying, oh, I love you so much. That's not about that. It's about like finding a breath and heart rhythm that can connect with them. And then gradually you come into rhythm with them, and then they come into rhythm with you, because even if they don't talk about it, they can feel it. So it's quite a radical teaching. As I mentioned in the book, Jesus uses love a lot in his teaching and in his example. There's no evidence, I can't find evidence in the Hebrew prophets. They did have successors. For instance, Elijah has Elisha as a successor, but the prophets, love is not a big deal in their vocabulary, and they don't seem to have circles of students that they love and whom they transform with love. For Yeshua, this is a very important, you could say, innovation. This heart love, this willing choice to love, very courageous.
Neil, we have some really nice questions coming in from the audience. So if you're ready for that, I'd like to maybe read some of those to you.
Sure, let's go for it.
Okay, great. So there's one here from Paula. Paula says, I have appreciated and been inspired by your work for many years, remembering dancing with you first at a camp in the Sierras. Thank you. My question is, my sense is that your teaching goes beyond this, but I'm very curious to know your thoughts on the scholarly discussion regarding the authenticity of the recording of Jesus's words, i.e. the work of Bart Ehrman.
Yeah, I have some comment in the new book on not Bart Ehrman in particular, but on the so-called the whole historical Jesus, you could say, school of looking at textual authenticity. And here I'll switch and I'll speak some scholarly stuff since you asked. Um, the problem with the historical Jesus, all the different historical Jesus people, is that they're looking back at these texts with a 20th century, or in some cases it's even 19th century mindset, a way of looking that was not native to those people. And I'll give you one simple example. According to one of the most, you could say, most popular historical Jesus people, a saying is more likely to be authentic, that Jesus said it, if he says it more than one time. Well, why would that be? I mean, if you go to a spiritual teacher or a meditation teacher today, don't they necessarily, they're not always saying exactly the same words. They may change the words. So for instance, in these Beatitudes in Luke and in Matthew, they're different. So then, some historical Jesus people would say, well, then he didn't say any of them. They're all made up later. Well, I mean, really? I mean, wouldn't you change, if you're a wisdom person, if you're a mystic, we'll use the term that's used today, wouldn't you change the way you're speaking according to your audience? This whole matter of textual authority or textual primacy, as it's called, that is, which is the earliest text. I mean, this is like finding what's the smallest atomic particle. People are never going to find this because end of story, Yeshua spoke Aramaic. And you can't slice and dice texts until you find what's most authentic just by looking at little pieces. You have to look at the wave. You could have to look at the whole waveform of what Jesus is offering, not the particle. And one only can see that through Aramaic or through any Semitic language, I would say. It's the same with the Quran, really. So, I mean, not that you would see Yeshua through Arabic, but you would, if you look at the Quran through Arabic and the ancient Semitic language of Arabic, it looks very different than the translations that we have mostly.
Thank you for that question, Paula. And there's another, there's one here from Dan who says, what was Jesus' relationship to the jealous, punishing God of the Old Testament?
Well, I'll point you back, Dan, to what I said earlier. There is a change of attitude. There is a change of human consciousness between the time of the Hebrew prophets, the so-called Old Testament prophets, and the time of Yeshua. And the messages that are given through the prophets, and sometimes in the Psalms too, we could say. Some of the Psalms are a bit bleak in terms of, certain things were heard at that time. But again, I would point out that having looked into the Hebrew of much of this, it's not quite as polarized as it's later made to seem, for instance, by Christian theology. For instance, the Old Testament God was jealous and, is like this terrible tyrant and all this stuff. And then, Yeshua comes and brings the God of love. Well, as of these two different gods. I would urge you to read C.G. Jung's book, Answer to Job, which is the most profound view of all of this that I have found. And Jung didn't even know Aramaic, but Jung had a view into this transition of human consciousness between, say, the time when the book of Job was written and then into Yeshua and then further on. And I completely agree that's for me to agree with Jung. I mean, Jung is Jung, but I don't necessarily always agree with Jungians, but I do agree with Jung. So it's a different way of looking. So I would urge you to look into that book and really, really dive into it because it's a beautiful, poetic book by Jung. Thank you. I can't hear you, Jacob.
Sorry about that. I had my voice there. There's a question here from Marcia. who says, is there an Aramaic translation to English by Neil for the 23rd Psalm? Is it in one of his books?
Yeah, Marcia, a number of people have asked me that. The 23rd Psalm is in Hebrew. I did not do that, and I'm not quite sure why I didn't do it. I think probably because someone else had done it, and I thought it was quite good. But it is a beautiful psalm. The Hebrew does illuminate it quite substantially. One of the things that bring the 23rd Psalm into focus, and I won't get into the linguistics of it, is that where it says, for instance, thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. This is, I'm giving you King James English version here. This is relating to this whole early notion of chokmah, holy wisdom, that gathers everyone together at one table. And so though even this psalm, which could be quite a late psalm, it could be a post, we don't know where it is, but it's, even if it goes back to being a psalm of David, this whole notion that the inner self of a human person is not just one thing, but it's like a multitude of different voices. It's like an inner community. So our outer community is connected to our inner community. This is an ancient Semitic notion. And so the table that is prepared is like, okay, we've got problematic aspects of ourself, and we'll work with them. We'll deal with them in some way, perhaps in therapy or in using spiritual tools or both. And then we've got the parts that we know and that we're friendly with. And I do mention this in the new book, that this was also Yeshua's point of view. Let's bring all of these selves together to one table, not necessarily to listen to them all equally, but to work with them and to feel them embraced by, you could say, this sort of holy wisdom, sacred sense consciousness. And many early Jesus movement people did see Yeshua, Jesus, as an embodiment of holy wisdom. Sophia is her later name, but holy wisdom certainly, or as her name would be in Aramaic, Hakima, sacred sense. So that sort of is a segue from 23rd Psalm. But yeah, there's some beautiful things in 23rd Psalm. And sorry, I haven't done that yet, line for line or word for word.
There's a follow-up from Marcia or Marcia that says, who did write more in length about what you're talking about now?
Oh, you mean, I'm not sure. I can't pull that out right now.
Okay.
But probably one of the Jewish renewal people, I would expect. Probably one of the students of Rabbi Zalman Schachter, or, one of those folks. I would expect one of them. And a number of them have lovely books. The names are escaping me right now, but yeah.
There's a question here from Olivia who says, thank you for your life work, translations, and beautiful practices. I've been taught that the Sufis have a system of 7 levels of nafs, each successive level a more mature human being. How were the Sufis influenced by Jesus' teaching on the nafsha? Both seem to treasure the development of the human heart, soul.
Yes, well, certainly. The Sufis in particular find Yeshua, or Isa as he's called in Arabic, a great inspiration. There are many Sufi stories of Jesus, and I put them in this other little book I did called, I think, A Little Book of Sufi Stories. Nice generic title there. All my favorite Jesus stories from the Sufis. Yeah, some Sufis have 7 levels of this naf, some nafs being the Arabic for nafsha. Some have 12, it can go on and on. Yeshua didn't complicate things in that way. That's again, another 600 years later. But certainly this idea of transforming the human self is key to Yeshua, that we're here to transform the human self in a positive way, rather than just, exit out and eliminate it. It's a gift. It's meant to be used. So this progression, which is really a progression in breadth that the Sufis have through these different stages of the human self. One of you could say the wisest views of this I read was that it isn't really like a ladder. Well, now I'm here, and then I'm going to try and move up to here, and then I'm going to go to there. But actually, we're going through all of this sort of at this one after the other every day until we reach this stage where we're just in this called nafs al mutmaina. We're, like whatever's coming up, that's great for me. And whatever comes next, that's fine. And if this is my last day, that's fine. And that's putting it in more colloquial terms. But that's sort of the comforted and comforting nafs. It's not only comforted on an individual level, but it's comforting to those around us. But there's a lot of great stuff. I would recommend, if you want to read up or listen to some stuff on this, Sheikh Fadlallah Hayeri, his YouTube channel, SFH Foundation. He's great on the Quran, and I do work with him and have been helping him with some ancient Semitic language stuff. But he's helped me a lot more. So he's a Sufi you can trust and you can check in with.
I think we have time for one more audience question. And this one is from Du, who says, did Jesus consider the name of God, Allah, or another deity name like Jehovah, to be God as divine essence or divine energy, and therefore truly God, or merely a conceptual designation?
All of these names are place markers. They are, and again, I'll switch to Buddhism, they're fingers pointing at the moon. Different cultures, different traditions, and I put my world spirituality hat on, name this different ways. The Tao, Allah, the name that you mentioned, Jehovah, that's a mispronunciation of probably what was just the sound of our own breath, according to my friend Rabbi Arthur Waskow. So these 4 letters, the tetragrammaton in Hebrew, these are breath sounds. So it's the so-called unnameable name because you can't pronounce it. It's the sound of your own breath. We're supposed to, again, remember that our own breath connects us to that mystery, that reality. So yes, they're not conceptual terms. The notion of a conceptual term in terms of a name for God would have been unknown in ancient times, anywhere, I would argue. Whether in ancient Greek mysticism, the pre-Socratic mystics that my friend Peter Kingsley writes about, or in the Middle East, or in Far Asia. The notion of a conceptual, all the concepts come later. I'm sorry, that's how it goes. First, there's the mystic, the shaman, the visionary, the prophet, and then later come, you could say, the way of trying to continue that in its good sense, which slowly becomes more and more conceptual until there are concepts we're supposed to believe in order to be saved. That wasn't Yeshua's point of view. He didn't want you to believe certain concepts to be saved. He didn't promise to save your soul. He wanted your soul to save you, which is one of the sound bites I tend to use. But anyway, that's true. So, in other words, that it was an experience for them of what cannot be named.
I want to thank all our audience for being here first, and then also for all of your wonderful questions. I've got one more question for you, Neil, but I just want to remind everybody, we've been speaking about Neil's latest book, Revelations of the Aramaic Jesus. It's a really wonderful book. I encourage everyone to check it out. And it's the culmination, really, of 40 years of work by Neil Douglas-Klotz. So it's really a wonderful book. I wanted to ask you, Neil, because I know your first book, Prayers of the Cosmos, was focused on the Lord's Prayer, as you call it, also Yeshua's prayer. And the first chapter of this book, you revisit that. Why is that prayer so significant in Yeshua's teaching? And also, I wanted to ask you about the word abun, because I know that's your website is abun.org. So can you explain for us the significance of this prayer, and particularly this first word in that prayer, abun?
You want this in a couple minutes, do you, Ross?
Go.
Yeah, well, okay, I'll be brief, but for me, said shortly, Yeshua's Prayer, which I don't call the Lord's Prayer because there's no Aramaic word that is rightly translated Lord, I feel, or actually even any Hebrew word. But this prayer is a template for everything that he's offering. All the things I've spoken about today, the prayer is not just words spoken to some deity out there. It is a process of, you could say, of realization, using a more modern term, of the breath, the big breath coming slowly, slowly, slowly into us, gradually into our everyday life, even into the parts of us that are forgetful or unripe. And then you could say transforming us from inside out, from upside down, from all of that. So I've done long retreats just based on Yeshua's prayer. Even online, I've done these. You can look on my website and you'll find some of these things. It's the place to begin. It's also a few words. Anyone can learn it. You can go to my website. You can click on buttons and learn to say the Aramaic prayer. It's a healing prayer. It's a prayer of protection. It's like all in one as far as I'm concerned. It's where I began all of my work more than 40 years ago. And I thought that was probably enough, but then things just kept going. So, the reason I wrote the new book was largely because there were things that I would have changed about the original book, the 1990 book, Prayers to the Cosmos, and the publisher didn't want to hear from me. So basically, because they had been bought out by a large media conglomerate, go figure. So I'm speaking to all of you now at Banyan Books, the independent bookstore, which you should patronize. But so anyway, that's long story short. But a wound is the breathing life of all, as I sometimes call it. It's not a being out there. It's more a process. I've translated originally, O birther, father, mother of the cosmos. You create all that moves in light. Now, if I wanted to even use fathering, mothering, I would say fathering, mothering. These are processes. You are creating all that is moving. Every moment in light, in sound, in vibration, this is being created around us. Yeshua is pointing to something that is far beyond a being sitting somewhere in some transcendental heaven. This is here and now stuff, friends. That's what keeps me going in this work, is it finds a home in people's hearts and people use these things. So I appreciate, that you've all tuned in, and thanks also to Ross and Jacob for inviting me.
Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for joining us for Branches of Wisdom, a podcast of Banyan Books and Sound, Canada's spiritual and healing resource since 1970. Our podcast producer is Jacob Steele. The show is edited by Abdo Habani. Watch all our conversations on YouTube by searching for Banyan Books, or listen on your favorite podcast platform. Please subscribe, follow, like, and leave your reviews and comments. We love to hear from you. For all our live events, books, and more, visit us at banyan.com.